Good morning, good evening, or good night for people who are around the world and in the zone I am now. It is US. My name is Shwa, and I have a guest who I've been waiting for to be on my show since last year. And I am glad that he found some time. He's on Light Up with Shwa, our weekly podcast on conscious living and parenting. So we will find more about him and his work and what are his thoughts. So welcome, Saeed.
Assalamu alaikum to your audience. My name is Saeed Khan, and I'm a senior lecturer in Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, where I've been teaching a variety of courses in the realm of Islamic and Middle East history, politics, and culture. But also adapting to the new realities of the world by teaching courses on globalization and global studies.
Oh, so that is additional to the expert areas that I read on your profile.
That's correct.
Oh, that's additional. Wow. Okay. All right. Good.
This is actually a second career. I used to be a practicing lawyer for about a decade, and then 9/11 happened. And when the events of 2001 started to take shape, and particularly as they started to have an impact on the community, both the South Asian and the Muslim communities respectively, I noticed that there was an adaptation that needed to happen, that there was a new demand that was being put upon particularly Muslims, that at one time they had to be theologians, philosophers, political scientists, economists, lawyers, as well as sociologists. And this was becoming overwhelming for the average Muslim American who was being confronted with a series of questions in the grocery line or at work or at school. And as a result, there was a real sense of almost paralysis with so many people. They were becoming quite dejected as to what was the burden being placed upon them. During that time, there were a lot of new ventures and projects. We find that mosques and other spaces were opening themselves up for exactly the kind of questions that they were receiving being answered. That kind of open house mentality also led to churches and other spaces opening their doors to hear what Muslims had to say. And as a result of that, shall we say, it was a matter of getting thrust into a new area of engagement. Well, fast forward a few months from that, I realized that there seemed to be a need for Muslims to demonstrate that they had something relevant to say within American society that was in line with American society, not incompatible with it, and at the same time for broader society to recognize that there is a seat at the table and that a Muslim voice needs to be there. And so I got together with a couple of close friends with an idea that I had, and from that idea we launched a think tank called the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And so ISPU essentially came about by necessity to fill a void after 9/11 so that Muslim Americans could demonstrate as well as research in areas of social and domestic policy what were their perceptions and how those would then fit in with broader Muslim American society. And 18 years on, ISPU now, I'd like to say, is probably the leading, if not only, research association that focuses solely on the Muslim American experience. And as a result, it has been quite effective in changing the narrative about Muslim American life. So no longer can people freely invent statistics or memes or narratives about the Muslim American community, because it can then be immediately refuted with kind of data that ISPU is able to not only generate itself, but also to analyze and interpret. And so ISPU.org is now a go-to site not only for members of the community, but for media outlets, policymakers, as well as for the government. Anyone who is interested in getting an accurate representation of the Muslim American experience. Now, after founding that, I realized that it was the kind of work that would probably find me better within an academic environment than in my legal capacity. So I decided then to make the jump from law to academics and never looked back.
Wow. Amazing. So you are in teaching now, and you are speaking on different topics around the globe, I think. You travel a lot, right?
So, I mean, it is the topic that I have as far as what is my research area and what is my discipline, being in the area of Middle East studies as well as Islamic studies, it lends itself to always being relevant. There's always something happening in the news cycle that requires an interpretation and analysis. Beyond that, it is also a topic that has different dimensions in different parts of the world as well as a healthy, or some would even say an unhealthy, curiosity that people have to try to understand this phenomenon that is the Muslim experience. And so that is something that takes me somewhere between 75 to 100,000 air miles a year, whether it is nationally or internationally, meeting with either governments to consult them, academic conferences, and then on occasion also some additional research.
Nice, very nice. So do you enjoy that?
Oh, immensely.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
That's good. That's why you're doing it. Okay, so you wouldn't want to go back, it means, to your initial job. No, as you said, never look back. Okay. So can you define a little bit about why did you choose these three areas? European Muslims, so do you teach in that? US politics, Islamic bioethics, that means you are teaching and also speaking and educating people and governments about it? Is that what it means?
Yes, so one of the things as far as the areas that seem to have now come within my circle of both interest and research, again, was a matter of necessity. When we founded ISPU, one of the elements that we had as a focus was trying to be cutting edge. We always wanted to not focus so much on, well, certainly not the past, or even so much the present, but we wanted to be in a position to then forecast what were the trajectories of the Muslim community, both locally as well as internationally, be able to assess that, and then hopefully, in some cases, guide the Muslim community toward these areas which we feel were of paramount importance and priority for them to focus. So when it comes to bioethics, when it comes to genomics, this, along with artificial intelligence, is the new future, the brave new world, if you will. And faith communities, by and large, and particularly those that have gone through as much trauma and transformation as the Muslim community has, tend to lag behind, and they become then the recipients of so much of what this technology brings about. So I felt that it was important for that to be on the radar for Muslim community, to at least understand some of what was going on so they wouldn't be hit by the impact of this without realizing that it's coming down the way. When it comes to the European Muslim context, particularly for Muslim Americans, there was the need to understand that here we find when people frame the issue of Muslims as Islam and the West or Islam against the West, well, European Muslims are, again, one of the largest groups in the West, along with Muslim Americans. There are some similarities, but there are some stark differences in the experiences, the backgrounds, the histories, and maybe even the futures of these two groups. So it was an important area to compare and contrast.
So you do compare European Muslims with American Muslims?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Any one or two differences for our audience to learn about, like some positive differences, let's put it that way? Anything that you can talk about?
Well, I mean, as far as the Muslim American experience goes, one can say that it is, by and large, a more positive experience than that which European Muslims have to face. Now, part of that has to do with European Muslims are dealing with a legacy of colonialism, post-colonialism of their native countries, and so that brings about a certain dynamic to the relationship. Europe, of course, is also a collection of countries which were organized around a common ethnicity, language, culture, identity, whereas America was not. And so in Europe, a Muslim can live there, or his or her family can be there 5, 6 generations, but they may never be considered to be British, French, German, Italian. Whereas in the American experience, being the land of immigrants, the idea of becoming an American is usually very organic and something that can occur even before achieving nationality or citizenship. And I think that's probably the biggest difference.
Wow, that is interesting. Going back to, so bioethics was, in Islamic bioethics, because I was talking to my boys and they were like, oh, Islamic bioethics, that's interesting, because usually you talk, bioethics is, a more scientific or medical term. Is that where it has been used? And to be, or I must not be understanding it like, is it, you can use it in social sciences this way?
Absolutely. I mean, Islamic bioethics includes such things as end-of-life decisions. What is required, for example, when it comes to life support, whether to refuse life-saving measures at end of life, whether one can withdraw life-sustaining measures or technology once they have already been implemented in an individual. These are matters and principles that Muslim scholars are certainly grappling with, and with the field of medicine and healthcare changing as rapidly as it does, both when it comes to the idea of sustaining life, but also this added issue of the quality of that life which is being presented. It then brings ethical as well as philosophical issues to the fore. The other issue, of course, is genetic engineering. I mean, stem cell research as well as gene therapy are coming on board. What is the Islamic perspective of this? How much, quote-unquote, playing God is permissible within a Muslim context?
That must be interesting. So there are other scholars, Muslim scholars, that you find yourself in debate, or are you always on the other side, or are there scholars like you who exist and who are aligned with your thought process?
Well, I'm still a minor player within the area of Islamic bioethics, and I leave that to people who are far more embedded in that. And the good news is that there are such Islamic bioethicists and ones who engage on a broader level and at the highest levels with bioethicists from other fields, other faiths, and other factions. It would be unhealthy if there wasn't a robust debate about these issues. But it's nice that, and what I would like to go ahead and provide is perhaps a multidisciplinary approach to Islamic bioethics, that it's not just about the theology and it's also not just about the technology. Also, what needs to be considered, for example, is what are going to be the political and the legal and the cultural implications of these kinds of issues as they're played out in various societies.
So we need to continue our research along with the times, right? And you can, for the future generations as well, because if we are, does it mean that we didn't have bioethics, Islamic bioethics before? What timeline would you say, like for somebody like me, a common person who doesn't really know much about it and does just know about from the current Kyle Center or your work or others, was it never part of our Islamic history, or was it?
Well, quite the contrary. It has always been part of Islamic history. Perhaps the major difference that has occurred, well, two major differences, is one, we no longer are a civilization which governs our own rudder. With the loss of Muslim empire, came the loss of agency, and generally speaking, then that led to others dictating what was important and what was not important for those societies. But the other big difference is that in the past, 1,000 years ago, when we had incredible scientific breakthroughs, discoveries, inventions, and development of knowledge, you find that Islamic bioethicists were there, but they were usually contained in one individual who was both a philosopher, a theologian, as well as a physician. So people, for example, like Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna in the West, or Razi, or Averroes, these individuals were polymaths. They were experts in each of these things. So for them, they didn't have to go out and necessarily consult other people who were specialists in each of these fields, because they were actually expert in all of those fields. We now live in a society where we have specialization and subspecialization, and so the challenge then comes for people who are specialists and subspecialists to then convene and engage with others and share that knowledge in order to come up with something that is integrated.
Oh, okay. So let me come to my topic of, before going there, has your research, education, and areas taught, what have they taught you personally, and does it make your work easier with all this knowledge and expertise that you have?
Well, I mean, I guess the easy question or the easy answer is that this never turns off, and I'm glad it doesn't. And so it's, I feel it's important not only for myself, but also for understanding society and for society in general.
Oh, sorry. You said this, so for the audience who are listening, you are referring to...
I was pointing at my head.
Yeah. For video audiences, it's easy to see, but yeah.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
It is something that I don't really allow myself time to turn off, and I wouldn't want to anyways. But this idea then of, again...
So how do you relax? Don't you let, stop thinking anytime? Like according to some meditative disciplines, you might be like, okay, so you're all the time thinking? Don't you get a break?
I find thinking actually be quite meditative. So I'll give you an example. I mean, I recently was flying to Southeast Asia and had some very, very long flights. I actually enjoy putting on a movie and thinking with the movie in the background. And sometimes what happens is something will be said in a movie that will then trigger or evoke something else, and you can then tie it into something. And so maybe linear thinking is not the only way to think, and you sort of then create a cerebral montage where you're making all of these dots connected.
Nice.
For me, it's an exercise where I want to try to understand the world better. And I don't only want to understand it for the now, but I want to get a good picture of where it is going. And as a result of that, and given the fact that there are so many interlocking parts, it's really critical to try to understand not only how many parts there are, but how they work in conjunction with one another.
Wow, yes. So do you want to give this knowledge and approach to your children in some ways?
Well,
or is it with you only?
Well, I hope not. I hope that when I open my mouth, that knowledge is coming out, and also I hope that ears are open at the same time. I mean, I think it takes two components of that. But I think the bigger question is always, especially as a parent, but also as an instructor when you have students, is it's always important to take the student or the child where he or she lies. I think unfortunately what oftentimes happens is that there is an insistence that the child come to you or the student come to you. And this is where you find the biggest waste of energy and resources, that no one is really listening and therefore knowledge is really not being imparted.
Okay.
So you then try to contextualize it to what is the child's or the student's reality. Now, in most cases, I find that the best kind of knowledge to effectively be transferred is through, I guess to use the scientific term, osmosis. It's not always through a kind of explicit hit the hammer on the head approach. But if they develop a kind of, and this is a term today when you hear about the internet, the cloud, if you create a space, an atmosphere, an environment where that knowledge comes in and is absorbed organically, you find that the retention level is certainly far more than the whole idea about rote knowledge, where kids are sitting there with their heads bobbing up and down like you see in old movies and in old societies.
Yep. Okay, good. So I'll be shortly coming to your parenting. Before that, how would you define conscious living with all your knowledge? I want to have a good definition from you. That will be helpful.
Sure. So, I mean, for me, conscious living is always being on. You asked the question before that do
you turn off?
Stop at all, and I think that the very epitome of conscious living is to always be thinking. And again, it is not something that is exhausting. I don't find it something that burns you out. It's oxygen itself.
It should give more energy rather than exhausting.
That's right.
Yes, that's true. So what is racism, and what can we do to learn not to be racist?
Well, I mean, see, now this is, of course, the question of the time. First of all, I think there's the one has to be realistic. There is some level of racism in everyone. Okay. And part of that is that there are certain inequalities that are baked into the cake. Now, those could be ethnic, they could be socioeconomic, they could be ideological, but they do exist. It is how you overcome those kinds of inequalities that I think are the most important element of combating what we would call either racism or bigotry. The other aspect of it, I think, that is involved is that racism usually comes from a place of both ignorance and fear. Fear that there is something that someone may take away from you. And I think that in the current climate, there's this internet star now who is a cottage industry on decluttering. And she's extremely popular. I mean, her videos have gone viral, and she's created a movement by which people are starting to declutter their homes of stuff.
Yes.
And while I've got a lot to learn from somebody like that myself, the one aspect of decluttering that I would say is to declutter those things that you feel you need that you're worried that someone's going to take away from you. And if you start to define your life and your identity through things that are essentially immutable, that cannot be touched, then you find it a lot easier to both deal with racism, and for those who might find themselves, unfortunately, going into a realm of racism, they then would be less fearful of losing something. So, I mean, for me, if my core identity is defined by my knowledge, that's something I'm not really worried about someone taking away from me.
Good. Thank you.
I think it's important to realize that whether one is a scientist, a researcher, someone in the humanities, or even a parent, as long as they're trying to impart something or convey something, they always have to be cognizant of the fact that they bring certain biases, that they bring certain agendas, and they bring certain objectives. I mean, there's no parent on earth that is not going to go ahead and advocate for a particular point. Now, are they doing so with the best interests of the child? Most likely. I mean, unless you have really horrid parent. But at the same time, what is that agenda based? Is it out of a true sense of altruism for the child and for the benefit, or is it in part due to some insecurities that the parent might have of asserting power over the child and authority over the child? Well, similarly, we find that happening with academics. We have that happening with researchers, particularly when there's a profit motive, or in current society, getting the maximum number of hits or likes, either by their peers or on social media. So if we understand then that what might be the agenda, we can then go ahead and more properly vet how credible that knowledge is when it is coming from various groups. Now, if a scientist, for example, is doing a report on climate change, but their funding is proven to be from an organization that is anti-climate change, we have to then go ahead and infer what that bias is going to provide, and whether we should really take that information as gospel or with more than just a grain of salt.
But many people don't know about that part generally. I mean, you might know, and I learned it quite, not from the beginning. I didn't know when this researches were done and they were funded, and there is always an interest, and and the funder is trying to direct in certain, direction. I mean, when doctors used to prescribe smoking, you know, so now today it's, we know what it is. So that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it is basically knowledge, and that knowledge is not reaching everywhere. And like, let's say in our developing world, people don't know.
Well, you mentioned smoking, so there's two examples to that. I mean, there was a time when smoking was actually prescribed.
Yes.
For example, if you've seen the movie The King's Speech, King George VI was, in fact, prescribed by royal doctors smoking to ease the throat muscles,
yes,
so that it would perhaps minimize his stutter. At the same time, they also used to prescribe that he put marbles in his mouth and then speak in order to improve his diction. Now, these are ridiculous. Now, that is still, despite the fact that it was misguided, something that one could say is free of bias.
They believed that at that time, I guess.
Yeah. Now, at the same time, if, for example, a report on the merits of smoking was underwritten by Philip Morris, well, that has to be seen in a different light, because then the economics of the research and who is supporting it is entirely different than even the naivete and the misguided industry standard at the time when it came to smoking. And so we find that that is something to contend with, and it's always, and particularly now that it's facilitated with the internet, it's always important to then go into the background of researchers and scientists to see, is this person being guided by a particular stream of religious orthodoxy? Is that what's guiding their perspective? And if you can then find some people who are less corruptible by economics and politics, that can probably lead you toward research that is more credible.
Yep. Okay. Thank you for that. So let me ask you, what is parenting for you?
I think parenting is two things. One is instilling in children a sense of the world in which they have agency, in which they're not just simply passive members or on the receiving end of what the world throws at them. That then, by its very nature, provides them with the courage and the tools by which to handle issues, and even crisis issues, along with the confidence that the parents are always there for them. Now, being there for them may not necessarily be something that on an ad hoc basis they agree with. Being there for them may involve punishment for certain things. Being there for them may involve not necessarily giving them something that they feel is a necessity, or like some new electronic good or the latest update on a phone. But setting an agenda of an ethos that lasts beyond the relationship of parent-child. I think that one of the problems that sometimes happens is that parents don't look at their children beyond their own relationship with them. And that doesn't do well to equip them with all these other relationships. I mean, if you think about it, the parent-child relationship is one parent and that child, but that child is going to encounter hundreds, if not thousands, of people in his or her lifetime, and they need to be well prepared for how to deal with all of those dynamics.
Exactly. So let me ask, how many children do you have?
3 girls.
3 girls. And ages?
One is, let's see, she's 21. One is coming up on being 20, or actually, sorry, 19.
Okay,
and
now they're gonna get on you.
20, 19, and 15.
Oh wow, mashallah. God bless them and you. So they are grown up almost.
They are grown up. Yeah.
So how is it going as a father?